Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marie-Laure Vercombe. I'm the Director General of the French Water Partnership. Welcome to World Water Week for those who are just joining us online today. And thank you all for joining us for this session on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by the water and sanitation services. Just a few words about the French Water Partnership. So we're a multi-stakeholder platform. We have 200 members. Among them, you have, of course, water and sanitation organizations. But this publication that we're going to describe and talk to you about is the fruit of the work of a joint collaboration with the International Water Association and of lots of different expertise. We have here a representative of GIZ who contributed to that publication as well. And so, yes, so you'll have a lot of interesting case studies. We will also present this publication at the IWA Congress in just a few days from now, and at the COP also in Sharm el-Sheikh, as it is very important to underline that there is a lot that can be done by the water and sanitation services, and thanks to them, there is also a lot more than can be done. So without further delay, I'd like to give the floor to Corinne Tromsdorf, who's going to actually present the publication. Corinne.
Thank you, Marie-Laure. Let me just share my screen and the presentation. So what I'd like to share with you today is a very quick overview of what is in that publication. The publication is called Reducing the Greenhouse Gas Emissions of Water and Sanitation Services. As Marie-Laure stated, it is a collaboration between the French Water Partnership and the IWA, as well as ASTE also contributed. So ASTE is the French Water Professionals Association, similar to the IWA, the International Water Association, but at national level. And I'm here as I'm myself the CEO of Water Cities, but I'm also a board member of ASTE and of the French Water Partnership. The book is an open access ebook, just so you know, and you have the reference on that slide. So first of all, why this book? Why this book in this collaboration? Well, there is a climate urgency, as we all know, and as we've all experienced throughout the summer, and with all of what's in the news, even in the last few days. And actually, water and sanitation services have a share that they can contribute and need to contribute their share to decarbonizing our society. But also, they have a huge role to play in the adaptation to the impacts of climate change. So this is really underlying why this book is here, and trying to inspire professionals and planners towards decarbonizing the water sector. The context is also that there's a huge investment needed to achieve SDG 6, in particular SDG 6.3 on wastewater. And these investments can be either high or low carbon investments. So we will have a few choices to make in the future. And we want to inspire planners and professionals and governments into thinking this through so that their impact is as low as possible in terms of carbon footprint. And another objective was to also share a little bit of the French know-how on this topic. So what is in this book? It has 5 chapters. There's first of all an overview of the GHG emissions of the water and sanitation services. Then we have a zoom in on energy and what energy requirements are associated to these services before we actually look at levers for action, so enablers and solutions for actually reducing the GHG emissions. But then, as I stated in the introduction, given that adaptation is actually a critical task that water and sanitation services will have to play, we really wanted to have an additional chapter on how we can combine adaptation to reducing GHG emissions. And then the final chapter is a compendium of case studies and examples of solutions of things that have been implemented on the ground and that can inspire others. Just giving you a glimpse of what you can find in that book. Regarding the energy, what's interesting is to look at how much of the energy is actually related to the utilities themselves, so the services, and how much is related to the end users. And so we see that in many countries, you look at the top 3 bars, in many countries, actually the end users have a lot more weight in terms of energy consumption related to water. And then in other countries, if you look down, but further down, Spain, for example, the end users have a very low weight, but the utilities themselves have a stronger weight. So if you think about what that means, it's in some countries, solar energy is used for water heating in for domestic use. Direct solar heating, then it's not counted in then in the energy requirements of the country. But these countries are also often countries that have more water scarcity issues and that might have to invest more into energy intensive types of treatments like desalination or sometimes up to reverse osmosis if they need to recycle a lot of water. So depending on the type of or the context of the country or the context of the utility, you'll have very different profiles in terms of energy use, and also the weight of how much the end user impacts the overall GHG emission of this activity will be different. Another quite interesting graph that you'll find in that publication is if you zoom in now just on the utilities, so we leave the end users on the side for a bit, we'll see that the activities or the types of or the parts of the water cycle that have the most impact in terms of energy use are desalination, groundwater abstraction, so it's the whole pumping from deep under the ground, and wastewater treatment. So these are the activities that we'll have to think most about when wanting to reduce energy consumption. Now, in terms of GHG emissions, you might find it interesting that there is no graph. There is no graph because actually GHG emissions are a lot more variable than energy consumption. Energy is easy. Energy, you have kilowatt hours that are measured and you can put them in a graph. Greenhouse gas emissions are the result of a very complicated calculation. You look at how much is emitted from the process in terms of CO2, but in terms of nitrous oxide, methane, and which are then translated into CO2 equivalent. You look at the energy that is consumed, and then you translate it into a CO2 equivalent, but that translation varies a lot from country to country. You take Spain, or you take France, for example. France has a conversion factor of about 50 gram per kilowatt equivalent, per kilowatt hour. So every time you use a kilowatt, that is counted in as 50 grams of CO2. If you compare it to Germany, Germany has a 400 gram conversion factor. So utilities in France and in Germany can't really be compared in their GHG emissions related to energy, because they have a huge factor of difference when converting to CO2 equivalents. So this is why we do not have scientifically consolidated global figures on GHG emissions, because the variabilities between countries, between types of utilities, are just too different to present this in a very easy to read graph and like standardized graph. It would be interesting though to produce that and show that diversity at some point, but it's not done yet. In the industry, there is still people who kind of try to estimate what is the weight of GHG emissions overall from the water sector. And the numbers that are circulating is that it's about 3% of global emissions that can be attributed to water and wastewater services when accounting for their whole impact. So meaning it counts in the residential water heating usage. And just to give you a few orders of magnitude in terms of what weighs in these greenhouse gas emissions in terms of water and wastewater services, there's kind of a ranking of order of how much each weighs. So as we've discussed, end user water heating is a huge component in countries where fossil fuel is used for that water heating. The second one, which might become the first one in some countries if water heating doesn't rely on fossil fuel, is nitrous oxide from wastewater treatment. And so this is counted in as what we call a direct emission, or a scope 1 emission of the water and wastewater services. Nitrous oxide is produced when wastewater that enters the treatment plant is treated through the aeration process. And then depending on the type of process, you'll have more or less nitrous oxide that is produced during that phase. The third type of emission that weighs into the whole assessment is then the energy consumption. And again, in some cases, energy consumption might be the number one in your in the utility. If water heating is mostly direct solar heating, if you have processes that have very low nitrous oxide emissions, then your energy becomes your number one consumption, or your number one GHG emission source. And regarding the energy, pumping, when you look at global figures, pumping appears to be the one that is the most important. So pumping water from place to place. So the abstraction and bringing water to the right place to supply cities, and then the whole distribution system. And then the fourth GHG emission in terms of quantity would be from wastewater. Now, I have not talked here about what we call the scope 3 emissions. So the whole supply chain, meaning all the chemicals that might be purchased, or what happens to the products that leave the treatment plants, like sludge, for example. This actually also has quite a significant impact, can be a quarter of the whole emissions of the utility. But the assessments of these is quite new, and there are not so many figures on that at this stage. So what the publication really wanted to highlight once it has given that overview on emissions and energy and all that is really levers for action, and moving towards reducing the footprint of water and wastewater utilities through reducing the direct emissions, so process-related emissions, using less energy, but then also producing energy producing new materials. So with that, you actually don't reduce your own emissions, but you offset the emissions of others, or you reduce your own emissions by using this energy or these new products that are low carbon instead of purchasing them outside. The book presents these levers for action as under 3 pillars. The first pillar is sobriety. It's about lean and efficient approaches. The second pillar is the circular economy. It's really about reusing water, nutrients, and materials, and producing energy with different shades of that yellow and orange, different types of energy that you can produce. And then the third pillar is really about strategic choices. So it's more about this enabling framework that we might hear a little bit more about also through presentations that come. It's about raising awareness and education within your utility, so in the staff itself, but also of the stakeholders you work with, of the governance and all that. It requires, making that change requires a governance that supports low carbon approaches, that will support, for example, being able to produce energy as a utility, or being allowed to sell energy to a third party. Then another strategic choice is also the whole tariff system, having some incentives for end users to use less water, or incentives to reduce consumption in general. And the last one, but not least, is really regarding the supply chain. As I mentioned, this is something that utilities are just starting to look at, but that can be significant. You'll see in the books, you have this little schematic that then presents where each of those levers for action can be implemented, in which parts of the water cycle it can be implemented. And then you'll have a summary of all the projects and the examples that are associated to each of those levers for action. So if you're interested in efficiency of services, you'll see that there's a bunch of case studies that relate to that. Utilities have been working on that a lot. Then on others, you'll find a few, you'll find just 1 or 2 examples. So we really hope that this publication will actually inspire change and guide future planning of water and wastewater services. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Corinne, for this very detailed presentation about the book. My name is Geoffrey Lapillus. I'm working for the French Water Partnership as a program officer for water and climate. I want to introduce you to your next speakers, who is Diane Darras. I hope she can hear us. Yeah. And perfect. Hello, Diane.
Hello.
I will give you the floor with this question. What can the water and sanitation sector do to reduce its impact as an energy-intensive industry? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Geoffrey. I will need your help to show some slide, and we use some slide that Corinne has presented. First of all, I'm speaking on behalf of IWA, International Water Association, which I had the pleasure to be the chair for 4 years. IWA has been very happy to co-sign this document, although it has been mainly done at the beginning by the French Water Partnership, but then the translation has been done together with the French in order to be able to have an English translation. And I'm happy of that, because I think it's part of International Water Association to help people to have access to document. And it was important for IWA, and I thank the French Water Partnership for helping us to do that. So what I would like to comment is a bit to comment what action can be done. And of course, it's not directly IWA who can do things, but mainly the IWA members. So my first, I would say, comment would be on the. I don't know if you can put it so that it can be. Is it visible by the or not? Is it still small or big? So my first comment would be on the slide that Corinne has presented on the energy use. I think this slide is absolutely fundamental. It's very important because unless you have a kind of vision of how much water the water industry uses energy, you can't really mobilize. I mean, if you think that it is nothing, you would say, well, there are so many other industry partner who should do something. And by looking at that figures, you see that the impact of water in the economy and in proportion to what is done in a country can be very important. Of course, there are big difference because it's a percentage. So being a percentage, it depends a bit of what is done by the others. But it is interesting because even if there are big differences between countries and places, because between Europe or United States, there could be quite different order of magnitude. It showed that yes, the water is a source of energy consuming. And we as professionals, we really need to mobilize in order to reduce, in order to have mitigation. And we know probably more than the others that if there is no mitigation of climate change, it will be a disaster for the water, because water will be the first big act of climate change. So we have a responsibility of being also actors by reducing the energy use. Reducing the energy use, there is two things, and again, that slide is very interesting because there is two figures. In dark blue, you show how much the utilities or the companies or the how much you need energy to deliver water, to treat water. But when you look at how much energy you are using when you are a consumer, then you discover that it's much more. So when you deliver water, you deliver it as cold water. And afterwards, the water has to be most of the time transformed, heated in bath, in a shower, in your washing machines. And so you discover that the main impact of on energy is not to deliver water or to treat water, although there is an impact, but it's in the use of the water. And I want to stress that because as utilities, most of the time, we don't act really in order that the end user can be much more clever about the impact of the usage of the water. So I think this first slide is very, very important because it shows that the utilities have two responsibilities. First of all, reduce themselves the energy they are using, but second, help the end users to reduce the impact of the use of water. And that is probably a kind of revolution in the water business. So if you can bring me the second slide, please, Geoffrey, thank you. So there you have lots, again, Corinne was explaining that there are lots of possibility to act. That's what is proposed by the study, is example and helping people to think about and see where they could act. Again, I think there will be a presentation later on wastewater, so I'm going to focus more on the drinking water. I think the word sobriety is probably something which we really need to keep in mind. We can live very well, we can be very happy by developing more sobriety, and it is important, and I think IWA is pushing people to have a better attitude in that. But of course, it's sobriety for the water utilities, and I will comment it a bit later, by more efficiency, by being more efficient, by using better the tools they have. And in IWA, of course, we work a lot on that. But there is also reducing water and wastewater energy consumption by the end user. And I think that, again, that message is probably a new message, or a message that is not so easy to understand or to hear, because we still, in the utilities, have a difficulty to help our consumer to reduce their consumption. It's clear that when you are a company, private or public, the revenues you have from the end users are linked to volumes. The more water you use, the more the revenues. And practically 2/3 of the expenses of the utilities are fixed expenses. It's linked to management of the assets, it's linked to people, but not really linked to the volume of water. So how can you manage to push your end user to reduce their consumption, which means to reduce the revenue of the company, meanwhile you want to have a stable and a sustainable economical situation. So we need to develop a better understanding. IWA is developing also lots of discussion with regulators, water regulators, in order to help to find a new way of regulating the water price, in order to push people to reduce the consumption. Meanwhile, of course, you work on this long-term sustainability of the utility. Because if you are too aggressive, or if you don't think of rethinking about the revenue, you could go in a difficult economical situation for the utilities. And of course, it's not what we push and what we expect. But that message is probably one of the most difficult message today, because if you reduce, if you push people to be much more aware of their water consumption and water usage, because beside the water consumption, some usage are more not expensive, but have more impact on the energy, linked to the hot water usage. So you need really to push and move, and it's meant the kind of revolution in the way you manage the revenue of the utilities. Next slide, please. Yeah, on that slide, it would be the last slide again of Corinne, but I would like to comment example. On that slide, you see that inside the utility, when you go back to the consumption of energy of the utility, you have big differences depending of if you are in the groundwater treatment, desalination, or if you are on the wastewater part. The wastewater part or the treatment for recycling are energy cost, need energy. So of course, that kind of slide can help to say, where should I focus more? How can I reduce my consumption by looking? And you see that there are some big differences, because of course it's the slide shows differences depending where you are. So again, that is a topic where IWA as association is really developing through its specialist group work in order to be more efficient, to work on reducing the energy consumption, and it is little by little, and of course technology will really help slowly to reduce and to be more efficient. IWA has more than 50 specialist group, and more most of specialist group are looking at that part and how can you be more efficient. So the efficiency of the utility is absolutely clear. So I would like to sum up by saying that we need to work on everything. It's important to be efficient. IWA has worked in the past and is still active on the water-wise cities, which gives some principles. So it is also a way of having the global vision and looking where you can work in order to be more efficient. And on those principles, which are quite interesting, I would stress again, and it would be my last slide, please, next one. Or maybe it's Lola, okay. Do you have one more, Geoffrey, or not? Okay, that's fine.
That's the last one.
Okay, good. Well, all are important, but the 4 axis is on working with the communities, with your end user, in order to modify a bit their own impact. I think it is important, the utility inside, to be efficient, but it is very important also to understand that we won't do that without working together with the external community and, of course, the end user. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diane, for this really insightful presentation. As you mentioned before, you focused on the drinking water, because now we will have another speaker from a sanitation service and from the Greater Paris Sanitation Service, Monsieur Antoine Quentin. Your organization manages sanitation services for 9 million people daily. So how are you dealing with climate change mitigation?
Hi, Geoffrey. Thanks for the question. Hello, everyone. My name is Antoine Quentin. I'm an engineer at SIAP. This is a great Paris Sanitation Authority. And I will present to you today the low carbon strategy that we are currently building. So first, there is a map to locate the SIAP area, which is inside the Seine district of the European Water Framework Directive. The population of the SIAP in blue area represent half of the population of all basin. In red boundary, nearly 9 million inhabitants over 18 million inhabitants. On this map, you can see the SIAP facilities. The 2 first missions of SIAP are the final transport and the treatment of wastewater. SIAP facilities are composed of 400 kilometers of sewage transport and network, and 6 wastewater treatment plants. These plants are total capacity on dry weather of 2.4 million cubic meters per day. On this slide, we can see the objective along SIAP histories. The first one was to achieve a sufficient treatment capacity. The crossing curve between the treatment capacity and the sewage production was happened in 2007. This is a recent story. Then next, we have to improve this treatment quality to comply the European Urban Wastewater Directive. And then a significant decrease of ammonium discharge was observed in the Seine River, especially downstream the Paris region. To conclude with the water quality, the current challenge for sanitation is to make the Seine and Marne swimmable again, because the city of Paris is hosting the Olympic Games, and in 2024, we have to swim for the triathlon events. Once an objective is reached, it has to be maintained, and with the new objective. All these objectives are cumulative, and we have to do this while we have to mitigate and adapt to climate change and other systemic change. On this slide, we can see that the river Seine has to cope with a high human pressure. we can compare with two other French cities and their rivers, Strasbourg and Lyon. It means for Paris that to achieve the water quality goals, high level of performance in sanitation are required. And here I start with sustainable development. SIAP have since 2012 a strategy with three main axes. The first one is to reduce SIAP ecological footprints by preserving ecosystem and natural resources. The second one is to fight against climate change and reduce greenhouse gas emission. And to finish, meeting local women and men expectation. And this year, on April 12, the board of SIAP have officially approved to update this sustainable development strategy. And the main challenge of this update is to the integration of the National Low Carbon Strategy objective called SNBC within the activities of SIAP. And this strategy is complying with the Paris Agreement established in 2015 during the COP21 in Paris. For information, I put a link to the European Commission website where all the national strategy are listed for many countries. So for France, this strategy, National Low Carbon Strategy SNBC, was introduced by a law about energy transition law and green growth in 2015. The SNBC is the French roadmap to fight about climate change and is declined for each activity sector. So to comply the Paris Agreement, France must go from 458 megatons CO2 per year in 2015 to 80 megatons CO2 in 2050, are divided by 6 the French emission. This is definitely a huge step. The National Low Carbon Strategy have sectorial guidelines for transport, building, industry, etc. And for example, for the transport, the target for 2050 is to reach zero emission, not zero net, but zero. And the emission reduction target for sanitation, so for SIAP, are included in the solid waste activity sector. In France, since 2010, there is an obligation to carry out a GIG assessment every 3 then 4 years for company, public establishment, and communities. So SIAP calculates this GIG assessment since 2020 with scope 1, 2, and 3, but the scope 1 and 3 was not fully calculated. On this graph, we can see the SIAP history greenhouse gas assessment. The main variation is due to building emission in orange, and there is no significant change, no increase or decrease. So before the implementation of the National Low Carbon Strategy at the SIAP, we need to consolidate our GHG assessment in 3 steps. The first one is taking into account emission of N2O. As you know, this is a gas with a strong green gas effect. Second one is taking account of biogenic emission, not in the official report, this is not request. And the final steps is to taking account about the scope 3 emission, consider it significance. And to do this new assessment, we first used the ECAM, which is an open source online model of EWA. And for the example, in 2015, we reached 780,000 tons of CO2. So we are 5 times bigger than the previous assessment. If we focus on the year 2018, so this is not the final draft, this is still a work in progress. And here we are calculating the majority of the 3 scopes. And the main emission come from the scope 1, in particular due to N2O emission during the wastewater treatment. This is representing more than 50% of SIAP emission. Then come the scope 3 in blue, related to incoming transports or outgoing transports and building. And finally, the scope 2 in yellow, which is mainly linked to the CO2 emission factor of electricity. And in France, thanks to nuclear power, we have one of the lowest carbon electricity. So maybe in other countries, this scope could be more significant than in France. We also calculate the biogenic emission and all the avoid emission that we avoid emission are made by consumption of biogas instead of buying natural gas on markets. So we did this calculation for 2015 and until 2021. The starting point, the Paris Agreement 2015 is our starting point. So we put the national objective of the French low carbon strategy, and we, SIAP, have our objective to 2030 and 2050. At this point, we are able to start building a strategy, the first big line of this strategy. And this is still a work in progress, not the final draft. And at this point, we have 4 big steps. The first one is to consolidate the exploratory work we did with ECAM and develop a new model that will mix ECAM and the French regularity requirement. After that, we will build the low carbon strategy of SIAP with this objective to reduce by 37%. And after we will develop an action plan with all the list of action we can do to reduce emission. So we start to think about what could be this action. And as we saw in the assessment of GHG emission, a major immediate challenge is to reduce the N2O emission. So this is a big step. After, we have to rely on SIAP innovation on CO2, maybe do some capture or recovery. We have to developing investment to reduce or avoid emission. And this is the technical part. And after, we have to think about the social part and the cultural ruptures, like all the resource recovery they are in the wastewater, and to think at the source management for stormwater, for urine, etc. So if we focus on N2O, sorry, where comes the emission? There's 2 main technology to do the water treatment, and biofilter on the right have an emission factor of 57% bigger than another technology that's called activated sludge. And in SIAP, 66% of our treatment goes through this biofilter. Just to remember that all this nitrogen not goes in the river. This is our first mission of sanitation, is to avoid the river pollution. And over the year, we improve the quality of the river. And So how can we reduce the N2O emission? This is just a beginning, but there is many questions, but maybe in short term, we have to increase aeration, airflow. So we will raise the energy consumption, maybe change the water treatment process. This is the kind of question we can asking ourselves, or reduce the incoming nitrogen load. This is where the urine at the source is maybe a solution. On the other hand, there is a CO2, and thanks to our wastewater treatment mission, we have our disposal a large stock of biogenic carbon from food. So we could use it to produce our own methanol, for example, or we can change our fleet of diesel trucks to biogas trucks produce with our own biogas. The challenge is to go from carbon fossil to carbon biogenic. And also there is still many questions here. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Antoine. Now we can welcome our on-site speaker, who is Martin Kess from the GIZ. In order to introduce your presentation, I will ask you maybe one question. What are the best practices out there based on your projects around water and wastewater companies for climate mitigation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's precisely a good question, because that's what I'm going to talk about. I hope you can hear me well also online. And yeah, thank you for having us. Thank you to IWA and to the French Water Partnership for including us in the session today. So I will talk about our project, the WACLIM project. WACLIM stands for Water and Wastewater Companies for Climate Mitigation. And on the first slide, I will it's like a summary of the project characteristics. It's actually the oldest or the first global initiative sponsored by the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, which is about water and mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. So we started at the end of 2013 or the beginning of 2014 with implementing the project. So we gathered a lot of experience in these years, and actually I am here at World Water Week this year, including for sharing our lessons and our experiences, so that if others want to continue the journey towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the water and wastewater sector, that they don't have to make the same experiences that we did, or that they can benefit from some of our lessons. Our partner countries are Mexico, Peru, Thailand, and Jordan. Thailand was our partner country until 2018, and Jordan joined the project in 2016. And we have a very strong focus on urban water and wastewater utilities. So we are not active in end user reducing energy, which was mentioned before a lot in the previous presentations, but we focus on the work of the utilities. So I will go to the next slide. Please don't be too shocked when you see this slide. Actually, it looks better on the big screen than here on the small one. So one thing we learned is, if you want to really change sustainably how greenhouse gases are considered in the national and local water and wastewater sector, you need to have in mind the local level, the national level, and the international level, and maybe starting down with the local level. I think I'm now having a laser pointer, yes. Of course, we work on the ground with utilities. That's maybe where the main focus is, because that's where the action takes place. But it's always also important to work with the ministries who are responsible for water and wastewater management in the countries. And it's key as always in development cooperation when it comes to climate change, that the environmental ministries which are usually responsible for climate change as well and for reporting to the UNFCCC, that they have a good relationship with the water ministries. Finance is an important issue, and we have some good results in this regard, especially in Mexico, which I will mention later on. And it goes up to the international level. So international water sector institutions, I think this is you guys. So I'm here to also fulfill this part of our big picture. And something we found each time it's more and more important is to take a look at the consulting economy and the consulting firms at international and national level, because they are in the end the guys which are hired by the utilities or by the governments, and if they know how to measure greenhouse gas emissions and how to reduce them, it can help us a lot. So that's our results on the ground. The project will conclude at the end of this year, and that's what we achieved in our 3 partner countries. As I said, Thailand is not our partner country anymore, but I will say something about Thailand anyway. And I like to hear in the previous presentations, especially by Corinne, how different things are on the ground, and that's also why our focus is so different in each country. So Jordan is using 95% of the electricity generation from fossil fuels, so much more than France, but even more than Germany. And a lot of this electricity is used by the water sector because of groundwater pumping and often inefficient pumping. Also, there are many water losses in the system. So what we did in Jordan, we helped our partners to exchange groundwater pumps to get more energy efficient ones. And only this caused a very, very big reduction in emissions by more than half. And what's important for us and for the partner is also the reduction in energy use, electricity use, and electricity costs. And we learned that it's important to always see the 2 sides. So for us, it's very important to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for the countries as well, because they also committed to reducing emissions by the NDCs. But there are usually also co-benefits, like in this case, energy costs, which decrease. Then in Mexico and Peru, we have a very different energy mix. It's much less than the amount of, or than the share in Jordan, which is using fossil fuels. And in these 2 countries, we focus more on methane emissions. In Mexico, our partner has extended the wastewater collection system, and by this saved almost 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the wastewater system, 92% of which is methane. And that's particularly important because Mexico is the 3rd largest methane emitter from wastewater management. So you see, water can really contribute a lot to reducing emissions, particularly methane in this case. In Peru, especially in the Andean regions, most of the energy is produced by hydropower. So also there we did not do a lot on energy savings, but our partner in Peru, which is Ciudad Cusco in the town of Cusco in the south of Peru, which is close to Machu Picchu, so some of you might know it. They exchanged, or they improved the whole sludge management part. They installed a biogas generation system, and they are now generating electricity from biogas and using it. And there's also a co-benefit in this case. There's also economic co-benefit because they produce their own energy, but also they told us that the neighborhood next to the treatment plant smelled pretty bad. And so people who are living in this area, often vulnerable people to the impacts of climate change, also have a benefit from a better environment around this place. Oh, I said I would say something about Thailand. In Thailand, we did a study on the pollution of the Ping River in Chiang Mai. And we found out a lot of the pollution is from leakage in the wastewater system, in the wastewater collection system. And our partner, as a result, repaired many leakages in this wastewater system. So we saved, I think, 20% of the greenhouse gas emissions in that case. And yeah, it's the two cases, Peru and Thailand, are featured in the book, which Corinne explained in the beginning. All right, but as I showed you on one of the first, on this complex slide, it would not be enough to only work at the local level to reduce greenhouse gas emissions on the ground. So we also were always in close contact with the national governments, sometimes in bigger countries like Mexico, also with the regional administrations. Yeah, also if you have 9 years of project, you know, governments change. And sometimes we found that it's easier to work with the local governments or the regional governments if the national government is at the moment not prioritizing water or is not prioritizing mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. So just some examples. In Jordan, we succeeded in prioritizing greenhouse gas mitigation in the water sector through making it part of the NDC action plan. An NDC Partnership Action Plan. We also did something on climate risk management, so we also have a small component on adaptation in our program. This Mexican example means that there is a new water sector utility investment project financed by the Inter-American Development Bank, and they decided to use our methodology for reducing greenhouse gas emissions in utilities, and that's one of their performance key indicators. So I think that's a good way to institutionalize what we did. Peru, I was interesting to see how planning happens in France, and I remember that there was a 3-year period where I think wastewater utilities at least have to plan for mitigation and to prioritize strategies. So in Peru, we don't have 3 years, but we have every 5 years the need to update climate change mitigation and adaptation plans. And they're not just our partner utility, but 23 utilities doing these plans and updating it each couple of years. So that's how we institutionalize our achievements. Also, I will just go to the global level here. Our tool ECAM, which was also mentioned before, and I will talk more about later on, was used in a development bank loan project for project screening. So we're working with the Inter-American Development Bank, which used it in some cases in Argentina when they prepared projects. And they found that like the more advanced utilities, like the one of Buenos Aires, with people who know about the issue, they can make great use of our methodologies, but also those who don't, who'd never heard about the issue and who might think mitigation is rather a thing of energy and maybe transport. And we trained almost 500 experts globally on our tool and on generally on low carbon water and wastewater management. So here are some of our products together with IWA, which is our implementing partner of the project. As I said, our project will conclude at the end of the year, but we are very lucky and happy that IWA is taking over the main products on their knowledge platform, climatesmartwater.org. One of them is ECAM, which I will tell you later, but also this platform provides a space for exchange for utilities on how can we mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, but also how can we adapt to the impacts of climate change. There's also an e-learning, which is one of our products. If you're interested, you can go to waclum.org/e-learning. Maybe you can also just Google it. It's pretty new, so I hope Google has it already in their list. We don't have it in French, but we have it in English and in Spanish. I think this ECAM is maybe our signature tool. That's what the WACLIM program is most known for. ECAM stands for Energy Performance and Carbon Emissions Assessment and Monitoring Tool. and there's just a new version complying with the newest IPCC 2019 refinement of its methodology. It's used by our partner countries. It's also used by some multilateral development banks, also by our German development bank KfW. And it was also interesting to hear that at least in the wastewater sector, our French colleagues are also at least using it for building on it. And it's a free and open source tool, so everybody is also free to use the code and to adapt it for their own needs. Our Peruvian colleagues and our Mexican colleagues as well are now using it as a national standard tool for mitigation in their sectors. Also, IWA was leading this product, WACLIM Roadmap, and it shows you how to combine mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions with priorities for utilities such as operational efficiency, cost effectiveness. And I believe it's also on the climatesmartwater.org webpage. We had many discussions with research institutions, with practitioners around how do we account for greenhouse gases. And we found that the methodology which we use, which complies with the IPCC methodology, is not like the only one. And there are different opinions. Also in Germany, it seems like the newest IPCC, or not everything of the newest IPCC report is already adopted. So we produced a document discussing the equations and the methodologies behind our tool, and also alternatives and advantages and disadvantages of both. And this is the last thing we will do as a project, guidelines for greenhouse gas reporting. The reason is we were contacted many times by ministries and utilities from the water sector, also consultants, which said, we want to report our greenhouse gas emissions to our national government and from there to the international level, to the UNFCCC, but we don't know how to approach them. What is the right process? Is it the greenhouse gas inventory, or is it the NDC monitoring or the MRV? So that will be the objective of these guidelines, to find out which are the elements of the process where the water sector can contribute to. So this is my last slide. Main lessons learned. We tried to squeeze 9 years of project experience into these slides. And here are some of our main lessons learned. The first one is not surprising, and I think you wouldn't have shown up today if you don't agree with that. Greenhouse gas emissions from water and wastewater are relevant and are important. It's difficult to estimate how high they are and what the share is in global emissions, as explained in the presentations before. But I think we showed that water can contribute quite a lot, a significant share of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Co-benefits is super important when discussing with partners, with emerging countries or industrialized and developing countries. There are so many co-benefits when you reduce greenhouse gas emissions. For example, operational efficiency often becomes better through improved energy efficiency. Automation of processes is also a co-benefit, and environmental co-benefits, like in the case of Peru. So that's always one thing we think it's important to build on when discussing mitigation. Economic viability is not enough. That's one thing which surprised us a bit, because when we started the project, the assumption was we help countries to show that mitigating greenhouse gas emissions in the water sector is not only good for the environment and for the climate, but also pays off. However, not in all countries economic aspects are the biggest priority, I would say. It's often you have the government, the energy ministry, the water ministry, and maybe it's easier to discuss about the electricity tariff than to improve energy efficiency, just as an example. So if we still think it's good to use this argument, economic viability is one benefit of mitigation, or can be one benefit, but you also need to take a look at the institutional environment and what is the tariff system like, and do they really care that much about their economic processes. That's more obvious if there is an adaptation process, which we have oftentimes in the water sector. It might be easy to add mitigation, not to wait for doing a specific another mitigation process, but maybe jump on an existing project on adaptation, because this is often the priority. Yeah, high-level agreements. This speaks specifically to COP20 in Peru. We believe that we were so successful in Peru because COP20 happened many years ago, and at that point the government was very active and promised many things, like in every country when you have such a conference. Maybe we will have hopefully something like that in Egypt this year. And also the global methane pledge, which was accorded last year and at COP26. Also, we felt that it made more relevant what we do on methane savings. And the last thing, something we had to learn, water people need to understand how greenhouse gas emissions work, how you can measure them, how you can transfer between methane, carbon, and nitrous oxide, how you can reduce them, and how the cooperation happens. What are the processes? Who do you need to talk to report your greenhouse gas emissions? So these are our main lessons. If you want to become active on saving greenhouse gas emissions in the water and wastewater sector, please feel free to reach out to us because our project will be over, but we will still be there. Thank you. So I go over there, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Martin, for this presentation. Actually, now we can open the session for question from the audience. So I will go to you and give you the mic. And I think we have our other online speakers also on the line that can answer you. So yeah, is there any questions? Yeah.
Hello, I just want to say thank you very much for your presentations. I think it's very critical for climate change mitigation, but as well for wastewater and water treatment. My name is Kyle Rezik. I am a student at UNC Chapel Hill in the graduate program for public health engineering with a focus on water and wastewater treatment. So this was very relevant to my studies. And my question is that both desalination, the process of that, as well as water reuse, can be very energy intensive and require large amounts of energy, but there could be very viable alternatives to water security issues that we're facing worldwide. And has energy generation from biogas generated from wastewater treatment plants, has that been used before, or has that been considered to power the processes for those drinking water treatment options?
Who wants to answer that?
Yeah.
Oh.
You know, go on, Corinne, go on.
Okay. Well, I can start, and then maybe you can add a few more. So desalination or recycling water is definitely very important in places where it's water scarcity, but it should always be looked at after you've started and you keep implementing a plan to reduce water usage. So the first action to take is reducing the amount of water that is needed. But in many places on the planet, it's not enough to just reduce to actually meets the balance between what water is available in that sub-basin where your city stands or where your industries stand, and the needs, even once you've reduced. So just to say that indeed these processes are very energy intensive, and they shouldn't be looked at as the only solution. They're the second solution after having looked at reducing. And then regarding powering these energy intensive technologies with renewable energies, because you're talking about the biogas from the wastewater, but it could be solar energy, wind energy. I mean, there are many other renewable energies. This is definitely high on the radar of all the companies and all the utilities that look at implementing these solutions to have renewable energies power these systems. Jan?
Yeah. Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, I would probably say, but you should look at that, that if you have a wastewater treatment for a certain volume of water, probably you will be able to do a very small or much more smaller desalination plant. That is, the consumption of for desalination is higher in proportion of cubic meter than what you can produce on a wastewater plant. So as Corinne said, when you need definitively to make desalination, if you have no other solution, now there are some experience and which were quite well working using renewable energy. It was surprising because in Australia they've done that. There are big projects with renewable energy, and surprisingly, the price of the desalination plant with renewable energy was not higher than with traditional energy 5 or 8 years ago. And I say surprisingly because I would have been expecting that it could have been more costly. But in fact, when you were doing the dimensioning of the desalination plant, it was more economically able, people were more able to estimate the cost of long-term renewable energy than what could happen with biofuel energy or things like that, because they were a bit worried about how will the cost of that energy go up and down. And it's true that what we see today is that some renewable energy on long term can be at less expensive than other. So I think when you have to go to desalination or recycling, because you have no other solution, and so you need energy, you have to work on renewable, solar, wind, but probably solar and wind rather than biological. I mean.
I agree with you. I would like to add to what you said about desalination should not be the first priority. I totally agree to that. First should go demand management, reducing water use, and one particular sub-element, in my opinion, is water loss reduction, because often, especially in those places which are water scarce, up to 50% of the water gets lost before it reaches anybody. It reaches the groundwater often, which is, you can say, okay, at least the groundwater doesn't get empty as quick. But still, I think that's a particular form of reducing water demand in the long term. And the second thing, on using biogas, that's what we are doing in Peru, or what our Peruvian colleagues are doing. So we didn't pay for their operations. It was them who invested in biogas utilization and cogeneration for energy from biogas. And in Europe, there are already, I think, a couple of utilities which became self-sufficient, using their own energy, sometimes even feeding energy into the public grid. So even more than self-sufficient. And then we can go there.
Thank you. My name is Aldona. I have a question for Anthony. So my background is in applied environmental science, and I actually did research in nitrous oxide measurement at wastewater treatment plant in the southwest Sweden. And what I found, the most problems here for researchers and also for utilities, they don't know how to measure nitrous oxide accurately and precisely. So we cannot really come with numbers and percentage of how much nitrous oxide that we contribute from the wastewater treatment plant. So my question is, maybe this is a question that needs to be answered for researchers. How to convince a wastewater utility when we are doing this kind of research and we want to measure greenhouse gas in the wastewater, what argument that we should bring to the engineers or utility in general, so they are convinced enough that we are doing very important research. Thank you.
I don't know if I have the answer of your question, but in SIAP we have a department which is focused on innovation and measurement. And their work is to highlight all the research and to do some innovation about this. This is already in SIAP, but if you are starting, I don't have the clue. Maybe Corinne.
Yeah, actually, what SIAP has been doing is fantastic. They've been measuring their emissions already since a few years ago. It is, as you say, it is a very complicated process to measure N2O emissions from a process. And actually, for those who want to learn more on this, there is currently a masterclass on the IWA website. If you go to IWA Learn, there's a masterclass in 5 sessions that you can watch on replay that covers a lot of that. But the idea is to actually have just a few places where this measurement is made and communicate those results so that not all treatment plants have to do this because it's so complex. And then for those who are ready to tackle the issue and really start addressing their emissions, they can also work with AI simulations. So there are a few tools on the market that enable to kind of simulate what is happening in your plant. So you might need to actually do a measure for a month or so, but then the costs are not so high. And then the rest of the time it runs on an AI algorithm.
Yeah, thank you. Martin Gamble, thank you for excellent presentations. I have a comment, which is that all the buses in Stockholm run on biogas from wastewater sludge treatment right here in this city. So, you know, it's something obviously we need to replicate and do elsewhere. The last presentation, your comment on the economic viability, I don't know that we're talking about economic viability as in cost benefit analysis of all the different dimensions of what we're talking about here, which is very complex to unpack from an economic perspective, or whether you were talking about the financial impact for utilities, which are obviously 2 different things. But I was also very fascinated to learn from the gentleman from Paris about looking at the urine diversion. I was aware of this work from some 5 years ago, that it was being planned with the objective of reversing pollution in the Seine. And it's very fascinating to hear that you're looking at it from a perspective of greenhouse gas emissions. I was wondering, if you do the urine diversion and you take out the nitrogen from the wastewater, does that mean that you are going to look at different wastewater treatment technologies, or does it mean that the existing wastewater treatment, if we can measure it properly, will, as a result, release less NO2? That would be great to understand. Thank you.
We put on the table all the tools we can do for decrease the emission from N2O, and one of them it was to put outside the nitrogen of the wastewater. So we think obviously of urine source separation, but it's only on paper, and we don't thought about different kind of treatment, or how can we systematize this kind of separation for all the Paris area. This is huge. We have to do some titanesque work. But in Paris, they start some project, a building project. We are starting to do some urine source separation, and all the arguments are, all the benefits of separation of urine are exposed to agriculture, to wastewater reduction in pollution in water, and finally with greenhouse gas. So this is really the start of this thing.
Yeah, thank you for your remark on economic or financial viability. I think I should have said financial. We are actually, my colleagues are now starting to work on a document, on a scientific paper about this question exactly. You're welcome to be a reviewer of that if you're interested.
Any other question? Yes.
Thank you. John Ikeda, Castalia Strategic Advisors. So I was on a finance panel earlier this week, and one of the big messages was water finance is climate finance. And I'm really curious to hear if any of you have any good examples of, being able to use this evidence around the emissions that are avoided to mobilize climate finance from climate funds or carbon offsets. If there's any specific examples that you've seen that you think are should be replicated elsewhere.
For the SIAP, the main finance of the state came from two water treatment quality and the same quality. There's still no financial about greenhouse houses. So we will ask the state of France if we can have some ads.
Yes. Yeah, so I'm wondering if you're asking specifically on mitigation or adaptation and mitigation or both combined. So I think it's not a new message. I think water changes, climate change, and all these messages were around in Stockholm for many years. The issue was always like from a climate perspective, water people sometimes seemed like they want to take the money, but they don't really want to change anything in how they do the projects. And the argument is often, if we care about water resources, of course it contributes to adaptation to climate change because people might use less water. But there was always, or not always, but in some cases, not enough analysis of the case and what is the difference. What do you do differently with climate change and without climate change? In my opinion, though, the climate funds are now also increasingly asking for co-benefits on mitigation if you do an adaptation project. So you also have to take a look at that part of the story. And I think it's easy then to also to add mitigation benefits. In our subsector, water and wastewater utilities, you can build on our experience and on their experience already in other subsectors, like in water resources management, peatlands management, which is maybe part water, part natural systems. It's still more difficult, but there is a lot of research being done on that part too. And yeah, I believe we are much stronger if we show that we took a look at the adaptation side thoroughly, but also at the mitigation side.
Diane, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I was quite disappointed when the Green Fund started to work because the Green Fund has financed very few water projects, and I was a bit disappointed. One reason of it probably is that they like to see the real impact of the fund. And so until we are able as professionals to measure well what is the reality of today, how much we pollute, how much we have before, then you can really expect to have some funds, because then you can see that it's improved or not. So I think it is part also of our responsibility. It's true that the water business has mainly worked at the beginning on adaptation, because of course we are a bit worried about what will happen. That's true that if we work both adaptation and mitigation, but to receive funds on mitigation, we really need to show before what we expect, what we are going to do, and what will be the real impact. So until we had some real tools and clear measurement, which show in reality that the water itself has an impact, clear impact on the climate change, it was probably not so easy to convince to have funds. So I think it's part of the process is to show more the reality and to accept that as professional we have an impact on climate change.
Is there any other questions?
Different perspective to what was just said, but since Diane talked about the Green Fund, on another topic that is not about water and sanitation utilities, but I will mention on the financial part that one of the figures that we like to bring out into use at the French Water Partnership is that nature-based solutions, with water as related to water, apparently only represented to IUCN figure 1% of the investments in water. So it says something about what it is we're investing in.
Thank you. If there is no further question, maybe a last one from me. Especially targeted at Corinne and Diane. I wanted to ask you if you have like concrete examples of IWA utilities, like members utilities that have an aggressive policy for reducing the consumption of their customers. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I can speak about utility. There is two utilities which I can speak about. The first is the Perth, the city of Perth in Australia. You know that Australia is a country which has not so much water, and they had to develop new resources. And the Perth city was calculating that they should invest in a desalination plant. And they decided not to do it, but to have an aggressive policy in order to reduce consumption. Were able to show that finally that was economical, because investing in a new plant, which will be used from time to time, but not always. And on the other hand, investing in a policy where they ask people to reduce, where they help them to reduce, where they give them the means to reduce. For example, they were giving some small device in order to put in their shower, and after 2 or 3 minutes, the shower, the device was making music, things like that. So if you do that, I think it's quite a good example. So Perth city is really a good example. Of course, Singapore, everybody knows about Singapore. Singapore is depending on Malaysia for having some resource. They have been obliged to develop all kind of new resources, but meanwhile they do that, they have really a policy trying to help people to know how much water they consume, try to reduce. They give them even a shower tap in order to be full and thing. So I think there are some places, of course, for the moment, it's most of the time when they have an urgent need. So you need a very strong utility to be able to convince people, but there are very good examples. And maybe I would just also refer to a discussion I had once with the Italian regulator, because Italy also sometimes suffer from a lack of water. And they were thinking of having an increasive price for water, saying that if you increase the price of the water after a certain amount of water, it's help people to reduce it. And it gives you revenues because the price is more. So of course, my question was, when do you start At which level do you start the increasing of water? And the answer was not clear, but probably they were not so precise at that time, but they said, oh, 40 liters per day per person. 40 liters per day per person is low. Of course, you need to know how many people are in the house, so it's complex, but it's true that it is important. And last remark maybe, because they was said that Buenos Aires has an active action on wastewater and so on, but they still don't have meter. They still doesn't have meter on the water side. So people are still consuming something like 300 liters per day per person or 400 because no metering. So you have a good example. On my opinion, Buenos Aires is a bad example because if you don't put meter, I mean, people are wasting.
So it is now time to wrap it up. Sorry, Corinne.
It's okay.
So thank you. I think we can give a round of applause to all of our speakers today. And thank you to have attended the session. And just to say that the book that was mentioned before is available on the French Water Partnership website, both in English and in French, and also on the International Water Association website, so you can easily find it online. And yeah, thank you. Have a good day.
Allez, hop, c'est bon.